Before the snow began to fall in Berlin and the cigars were lit on Wilhelmstrasse, the machinery of the Great Partition had already been set in motion. It did not begin with armies, cannons, or declarations of war. Instead, the greatest robbery of the 19th century began with a smile, a charitable speech, and a deception so profound that it would take the world decades to unravel. At the center of this web sat a monarch whose ambition was far too large for his small country, King Leopold II of the Belgians. By the mid-1870s, Leopold had grown restless. He looked at the map of the world and saw the empires of Britain, France and Spain sprawling across continents, while his own Belgium possessed nothing but its modest borders in Europe. He was obsessed with the idea of a colony, viewing it not just as a matter of national prestige, but as a necessity for profit. However, the world had changed. Open conquest was becoming politically difficult. Leopold needed a mask. In 1876, the king made his opening move. He convened a geographical conference in Brussels, inviting explorers, scientists, and philanthropists from across Europe. With the demeanor of a benevolent grandfather, Leopold announced his grand vision. He proposed the creation of the International African Association, Association Internationale Africaine. To the rapt audience, he declared that this organization had a noble, dual purpose: the advancement of science and the humanitarian salvation of Africa. He spoke passionately about civilizing the savages and, most crucially, ending the Arab slave trade that still plagued East Africa. It was a masterstroke of public relations. The crowned heads of Europe and the wealthy elites were charmed. They saw a humanitarian crusade. Leopold saw a corporate acquisition. Under the guise of this international body, which was ostensibly neutral and charitable, the king began to lay the groundwork for a private empire. The association was the perfect Trojan horse. While the world applauded his philanthropy, Leopold was quietly preparing to turn a vast swath of Central Africa into his personal backyard. To execute this plan, Leopold needed a man of action, someone who knew the terrain and possessed a flexible conscience. He found his instrument in Henry Morton Stanley. The journalist adventurer had already achieved worldwide fame for his journey to find Dr. Livingstone. In 1878, Leopold hired Stanley, officially sending him back to Africa under the banner of the association. The public mission was to open up the Congo River to commerce and civilization, to build stations, and to suppress the slave trade. The secret mission, however, was far more cynical: to secure ownership of the land before anyone else realized its value. Between 1879 and 1884, while European diplomats were still debating the theoretical aspects of colonization, Stanley was on the ground, engaging in one of the most aggressive land grab operations in history. He traveled up the Congo River, carrying with him bales of cloth, beads, alcohol, and a stack of pre-printed legal documents. These were the tools of the bloody prologue. The encounters between Stanley and the local Congolese leaders were a tragic farce of diplomacy. Stanley, representing the king, would approach local chieftains and offer them gifts, often trinkets, gin, or textiles. In return, he asked them to sign a piece of paper. The tragedy lay in the translation. The local leaders, operating within their own cultural and legal frameworks, believed they were entering into pacts of friendship or simple trade agreements. They thought they were granting permission for the white men to build a trading post or to buy ivory. The concept of permanently alienating their ancestral lands of selling the soil beneath their feet to a man they had never met in a country they had never heard of, was utterly foreign to them. Yet, the documents they signed were ruthless in their specificity. These treaties, written in languages the chiefs could not read, ceded all sovereign rights, all legislative authority, and all ownership of the land to Leopold's organization. The chiefs, unable to write, would affix their mark a simple X at the bottom of the page. With that single stroke of a pen performed in ignorance, entire kingdoms were transferred into the private possession of a European monarch. Rumors circulated later that the deception was even more explicit. It was whispered that interpreters, paid by Stanley, deliberately misled the chiefs, telling them the X was merely a receipt for the gifts received or a symbol of protection against other rival tribes. The disparity in understanding was total. For a few bolts of cloth and the promise of trade, the chiefs unwittingly signed their people into a new form of bondage. By 1884, Stanley had secured hundreds of these treaties, over 400 distinct agreements. These scraps of paper, stamped with X marks, became the legal bedrock of Leopold's claim. They were the title deeds to a territory 76 times the size of Belgium. What made this prologue so unique in the history of imperialism was the nature of the entity acquiring the land. Unlike the British or French colonies, which were extensions of the state, the Congo was being constructed as a private enterprise. Leopold did not claim the land for Belgium. The Belgian Parliament had little interest in colonial adventures. He claimed it for himself. He had created a corporate prototype of a colony where the motive was not strategic influence or national glory, but pure, unadulterated profit. The International African Association had by this time morphed into the Committee for Studies of the Upper Congo, and later the International Association of the Congo. The names changed to confuse observers and maintain the illusion of a humanitarian committee, but the control remained firmly in Leopold's hands. As 1884 drew to a close, Leopold sat in Brussels with a stack of treaties that gave him a legal claim to the heart of the continent. He had successfully conflated charity with conquest. The world still believed he was a philanthropist, investing his own fortune to bring civilization to the dark continent. In reality, he had just completed the preliminary phase of the greatest fraud of the age. The stage was now set for him to seek international recognition for his private fiefdom. The X marks on Stanley's treaties were the keys to the kingdom, obtained through a cynical exploitation of trust and language barriers. The theft had already happened. All that remained was for the other powers of Europe to ratify it in Berlin. The prologue was over, and the curtain was about to rise on the main act. Section 2. The Trigger of Conflict. Portuguese-British Collusion, 1881-1884. While King Leopold II was quietly weaving his web of deceit in the shadows, the other great powers of Europe were beginning to wake up. The scramble for Africa could not remain a one-man show for long. By the early 1880s, the tension in the air was palpable, thickening with every new expedition that ventured into the interior. The trigger for the explosion, however, came not from the Belgian king, but from a collision of old empires and new ambitions that threatened to plunge Europe into war over a continent most of their leaders had never seen. The first domino fell in 1881. It was tipped by the French explorer Pierre Savournon de Brazza. A rival to Stanley, de Brazza was operating with the backing of the French government. while Stanley was securing treaties for Leopold on the south bank of the Congo River. De Brazza reached the north bank. There, he raised the French flag and founded a station that would bear his name, Brazzaville. This was no private enterprise. This was a direct claim by the French Republic. The planting of the French tricolour sent shockwaves through the capitals of Europe. Suddenly, the Congo was not just a blank space on a map. It was a contested prize. The rise of French influence and Leopold's mysterious association panicked the older colonial powers, particularly Portugal and Great Britain. Portugal, whose maritime glory had long since faded, clung desperately to its historical claims. They argued that their explorers had discovered the mouth of the Congo River centuries ago, giving them an ancestral right to control the gateway to Central Africa. But in the ruthless age of industrial imperialism, historical sentiment meant little without the power to enforce it. Sensing their weakness, Lisbon turned to London. The British, though wary of expanding their empire further, were terrified of French protectionism. They feared that if France or Leopold secured the Congo, British merchants would be locked out of the lucrative trade routes. Greed and fear drove the two nations into a clumsy embrace. In February 1884, the spark was struck. Operating in secret, diplomats from Britain and Portugal drafted and signed a treaty that was intended to end the argument once and for all. The terms were audacious. Britain agreed to recognize Portugal's sovereignty over the mouth of the Congo River. In exchange, Portugal would guarantee free navigation, but practically, this meant the two nations controlled the valve. They effectively sought to place a blockade on the entrance to the continent, cutting off access for France, Germany, and Leopold's association. The treaty was a diplomatic disaster. It was intended to stabilize the region, but instead, it blew the fragile balance of power apart. France was outraged. Leopold was terrified that his landlocked state would be strangled before it was even born. But the most significant reaction came from a man who, until that moment, had looked upon colonial adventures with disdain. In Berlin, at the Chancellery on Wilhelmstrasse, Otto von Bismarck watched the chaos unfold. The Iron Chancellor, the architect of a unified Germany, was a man of cold, hard calculation. For years, he had famously dismissed the idea of German colonies. "My map of Africa is here in Europe," he had once scoffed, pointing to France and Russia. To Bismarck, colonies were expensive vanities, liabilities that distracted from the real game of European supremacy. He was a practitioner of realpolitik politics based on power and pragmatism, not sentiment or exploration. However, the events of 1884 changed the equation. Bismarck saw the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty not as a colonial issue, but as a strategic opportunity. By opposing the treaty, he could align Germany with France, his traditional enemy, against Britain, thereby isolating London. Furthermore, the German public and merchant class were clamoring for their place in the sun, demanding that the new German Empire assert itself overseas. The Portuguese, realizing too late that their secret treaty had united the rest of Europe against them, panicked. Their attempt to secure their claims had backfired spectacularly. Desperate to salvage the situation and avoid a direct conflict with France, Portugal made a fateful request. They appealed to Bismarck to intervene. They asked him to host an international conference to settle the dispute. It was the moment Bismarck had been waiting for. The Chancellor sat in his study, the snowy Berlin winter pressing against the windows. He did not care for the jungles of the Congo or the fate of its people. He saw only a chessboard. By agreeing to host the conference, Germany would step onto the world stage as a global arbiter. Bismarck would position himself as the honest broker, a neutral judge in a trial of thieves. With a cynical precision, Bismarck seized the chance to enhance German prestige without risking a single soldier. He realized that he could use the African question to distract his European rivals, pitting them against one another while Germany watched from the head of the table. The invitation was drafted. The honest broker was ready to preside over the partition. The Anglo-Portuguese treaty had failed to lock the door to Africa. Instead, it had blown the hinges off, leading directly to the invitation that would bring the world's predators to Berlin. Section 3. Players at the table. 14 countries. One absent continent. November 15th, 1884. On the gloomy Saturday afternoon of November 15th, 1884, the doors of the Reich Chancellor's Palace on Wilhelmstrasse opened to welcome the architects of a new world order. Outside, the Berlin winter was grey and biting. Inside, the air was thick with the warmth of coal fires and the heavy scent of expensive tobacco. In the grand music room, a large horseshoe-shaped table had been arranged. Looming over it, pinned against the wall like a hunting trophy, hung a massive map of Africa, the General Carte von Africa. It was taller than a man, yet large parts of it were blank, vast white spaces labelled simply Terra Incognita. It was upon this paper fantasy that the eyes of 19 delegates from 14 nations were fixed. The gathering was a spectacle of European aristocracy and diplomatic stiff-collared formality. They were counts, barons, viscounts, and seasoned bureaucrats, men who knew the etiquette of a ballroom far better than the humidity of a rainforest. They arrived in carriages, their top hats gleaming, carrying briefcases filled with mandates to secure national prestige. But as they took their seats in Bismarck's smoking room, the most glaring detail was not who was present, but who was missing. In this room, where the future of an entire continent was to be decided, there was not a single African face, no king from the Congo, no sultan from Zanzibar, no chief from the Niger Delta had been invited. The conceptual arrogance was absolute. The inhabitants of Africa were viewed not as partners or even enemies, but as features of the landscape passive assets to be managed, much like the timber or the ivory. The cake, as King Leopold had called it, was to be sliced without asking the baker. At the head of the table sat Otto von Bismarck, the host. Dominating the room with his imposing stature and his reputation as the master of Europe, he opened the proceedings with a speech full of high-minded rhetoric about commerce and civilization. Yet, the composition of the table revealed the cynical truth of the affair. Of the 14 nations represented, many had absolutely no tangible interest in Africa. Delegates from the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark sat quietly, sipping their wine. They had no fleets in the Atlantic, no trading posts in the tropics, and no intention of acquiring any. They were there essentially as extras in a play, invited to provide a veneer of international consensus to the robbery being planned by the major powers. Their presence legitimized the process, transforming a land grab by a few into international law. In the end, 7 of the participating powers, half the table, would leave the conference without claiming a single square inch of African soil. Among this sea of European uniforms and monocles, there was one peculiar anomaly: the delegation from the United States of America. The US attended ostensibly as a neutral observer, interested only in the principle of free trade. However, lurking behind the American diplomats was a familiar shadow. Henry Morton Stanley, the man who had tricked the Congo chiefs, was present as a technical advisor to the American delegation. This was a tactical masterstroke by King Leopold by placing his own agent within the delegation of a disinterested superpower. Leopold ensured that the expert advice given to the conference would always steer the conversation in his favor. Stanley, the only man in the room who had actually walked the ground they were dividing, spun tales that suited his royal paymaster, lobbying tirelessly for the recognition of Leopold's claims. As the days turned into weeks, the disconnect between the map on the wall and the reality on the ground became the stuff of dark comedy. The delegates drew lines with red pencils, slicing through ethnic groups, ancient kingdoms, and ecosystems they did not understand. They traded provinces like playing cards. The British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, who observed the proceedings from London but whose agents were deep in the fray, later captured the absurdity of the situation with a biting witticism that would echo through history. He remarked that the gentlemen in Berlin were engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no man's foot has ever trod. With a cynical chuckle, he noted that they were giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where the mountains and rivers and lakes were. To Salisbury and to the men in the room, Africa was effectively flat, a geometric abstraction to be organized, not a living world to be respected. The atmosphere in the room was one of polite plunder. While the Ottoman delegate sat in his fez, representing an empire that was slowly crumbling, and the French and British eyed each other with suspicion, the map on the wall was slowly being filled in. The scramble was no longer a chaotic rush. It was being bureaucratized. The 19 delegates, fueled by excellent German catering and the thrill of empire, were not just dividing land. They were erasing the history of a continent, replacing it with straight lines drawn by rulers on a table in Berlin. The players were seated, the cards were dealt, and the game for the soul of Africa had officially begun. Section 4. The Rules of the Cynical Game. Effective Occupation. November 1884. January 1885. As the winter of 1884 deepened and the cigar smoke in the Chancellor's palace grew thicker, the conversation shifted from the romanticism of exploration to the cold, hard mechanics of ownership. It was not enough to simply claim a continent. The powers needed a legal framework to prevent them from killing each other over the spoils. The result was the invention of a diplomatic formula that would become the most destructive legal concept in African history. They called it the principle of effective occupation. Until this moment, the colonization of Africa had been a vague and often lazy affair. A European captain might land on a beach, hoist a flag, nail a plaque to a baobab tree, and claim the entire interior for his king, without ever stepping foot beyond the shoreline. This paper sovereignty was convenient for the old empires like Portugal, which claimed vast territories based on discoveries made 300 years prior. But for the new, hungry players at the table, specifically Germany and King Leopold, this old system was unacceptable. They wanted a game where speed and aggression were rewarded. The solution, codified in Article 35 of the General Act, was ruthlessly efficient. The conference decreed that for a claim to be recognized by the international community, hoisting a flag was no longer sufficient. To own a piece of Africa, a European power had to demonstrate that it actually possessed it. This meant the establishment of a physical presence. The colonizer had to build a fort, establish a local administration, deploy a police force, and ensure the protection of trade routes. Furthermore, upon taking possession of a new territory, the power was legally obligated to send a formal diplomatic notification to the other signatories of the Act. This allowed the other powers to check their own maps and, if they dared, to lodge a counterclaim. On the surface, this sounded like a rule of order, a way to regulate the chaos. In reality, it was the firing of a starting gun. By linking ownership to physical occupation, the Berlin Conference inadvertently triggered a frantic, violent acceleration of the colonial process. The scramble for Africa shifted from a metaphorical jog to a desperate sprint. Historians have since interpreted this decision as the moment the continent was transformed into a colossal chessboard. The logic was terrifyingly simple. If you did not occupy a territory today, your rival might occupy it tomorrow. A vacuum of power was no longer a neutral space. It was a vulnerability. This forced the European powers to push deeper and faster than they had ever intended. It was no longer about profit alone. It was about preemption. Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium began to rush troops and administrators into the fever-ridden interior, not because they needed the land immediately, but to deny it to their neighbors. They built outposts in desolate regions simply to tick the box of effective occupation. The rule that was supposed to prevent conflict instead necessitated a military invasion of the entire continent. The map had to be filled not with ink, but with garrisons. Amidst this drafting of rules for robbery, the cynicism of the conference reached its peak in the discussion of humanitarianism. The delegates, draped in the moral superiority of the Victorian age, made a great show of their commitment to ending the Arab slave trade. They spoke passionately about the sacred duty of Europe to protect the indigenous populations. Article 6 of the General Act bound all powers to watch over the preservation of the native tribes and to care for the improvement of their moral and material well-being. They explicitly banned the slave trade in their new dominions. This was the great lie of Berlin. While they outlawed the buying and selling of human beings in the traditional sense, the principle of effective occupation laid the groundwork for a new, industrial form of slavery. To make an occupation effective, the colony had to pay for itself. To pay for itself, resources had to be extracted. To extract resources, labor was needed. The very rules they wrote to civilize Africa became the justification for the forced labor systems that would soon decimate populations from the Congo to the Cameroons. The ban on the slave trade was merely a rhetorical shield. Behind it, Leopold and others were preparing to institute tax systems and labor quotas that would bind the African population to the land as effectively as any chain. By January 1885, the legal trap was set. The diplomats had created a system where the only way to validate a theft was to police the victim. They had codified the rules of the game, ensuring that the ensuing violence would not be called war, but pacification and administration. The gentleman's agreement was complete. The plunder of a continent was now a matter of international law. Section 5. The Grand Prize. Leopold's Congo. February 26, 1885. On February 26, 1885, the long winter of negotiations came to an end. In the great hall on Wilhelmstrasse, the delegates gathered for the final ceremony to sign the General Act of the Berlin Conference. To the applause of the gathered diplomats, King Leopold II of Belgium achieved the impossible. Through a combination of charm, bribery, and the relentless lobbying of his agents, he was granted the ultimate trophy. The conference officially recognized the Congo Free State, État indépendant du Congo, as a sovereign power. It was a triumph of branding over reality. The very name was a lie. It was not free, nor was it a state in the traditional sense of a nation serving its people. It was declared a neutral zone, open to the trade of all nations, a vast buffer state intended to keep the peace between rival empires. But the fine print told a different story. The territory was not placed under the control of the Belgian government, nor under an international committee. It was handed over to Leopold personally. On August 1st, 1885, the legal formalities were completed, and the Congo officially became the private property of one man. It was a feat of bureaucratic alchemy. A European monarch had acquired a personal estate 76 times the size of his own kingdom. While Belgium was a mere dot on the map of Europe, Leopold's new backyard spanned the entirety of the darker, lush heart of Africa. He was now the absolute landlord of 2.3 million square kilometers of rainforest, river, and savanna. The justification for this transfer remained philanthropy and free trade. Leopold promised to bring Christianity, commerce, and civilization to the indigenous population. But as the ink dried in Berlin, the mask began to slip. The neutral zone of free trade was rapidly converted into a closed monopoly. The invention of the pneumatic tire by John Boyd Dunlop shortly after the conference created an insatiable global hunger for rubber, and Leopold sat upon the world's greatest supply of wild rubber vines. What followed was a descent into hell that the gentlemen in Berlin could scarcely have imagined, or perhaps simply chose to ignore. To extract the rubber, Leopold's agents instituted a regime of terror that turned the entire country into a slave labor camp. The effective occupation demanded by the Berlin rules was enforced by the force publique, a private army equipped with the whip and the rifle. The king, who had never set foot in the Congo in his entire life, managed this machine of death from his royal greenhouse in Laeken. He demanded quotas. Villages were ordered to bring in specific weights of rubber. If the quotas were not met, the punishment was medieval in its cruelty. The agents were ordered to account for every bullet they spent to prove they were not wasting ammunition on hunting. The proof required was a severed human hand. Soon, baskets of smoked human hands became a currency of their own in the Congo. They were presented to commanders to justify the expenditure of cartridges. Men, women, and children were mutilated. If a father failed to bring enough rubber, his daughter's hand might be cut off. Photographs of Congolese fathers staring at the severed limbs of their children would eventually reach Europe, shocking the public conscience in the early 1900s. But in the immediate aftermath of Berlin, the silence was deafening. The scale of the devastation was apocalyptic. Between the signing of the treaty in 1885 and the end of Leopold's personal rule in 1908, the population of the Congo collapsed. Through a combination of execution, starvation, exhaustion, and disease brought on by the dislocation of society. It is estimated that up to 10 million people perished. It was a demographic catastrophe that halved the population of the region. The cynicism of the Berlin Conference was laid bare in the Congo. The diplomats had gathered to civilize Africa, yet they handed its beating heart to a sociopathic profiteer. The Free State was a prison. As the years passed and the rumors of the atrocities began to leak out, the literary and intellectual world began to turn on the king. Mark Twain, writing in his scathing 1905 soliloquy, King Leopold's Soliloquy, captured the spectral horror of the monarch's reign. He described the king not as a statesman, but as a monster hiding behind the trappings of royalty. Leopold is a ghost in a crown, Twain wrote, whose throne is built on skulls. The legacy of February 26, 1885, was not a treaty of peace, but a death warrant for millions, signed with a flourish by men who thought they were simply discussing trade tariffs. Section 6. What the conference did not do. Myths versus reality. There is a persistent image that has lodged itself in the collective imagination of history. It is a scene almost cinematic in its precision. A group of elderly European men in a smoke-filled room in Berlin, leaning over a pristine map of Africa with long rulers and red pencils, carving up the continent in a single evening like a Christmas turkey. We imagine that when they left the Wilhelmstrasse Palace in February 1885, the map of Africa was finished, crisp, defined, and divided. This image, however, is the greatest myth of the Berlin Conference. The reality was far more chaotic, prolonged, and insidious. The delegates in Berlin did not leave the conference with a fully drawn map in their pockets. In fact, the General Act of 1885 established very few specific territorial boundaries, with the notable exception of defining the rough shape of Leopold's Congo Free State. For the rest of the continent, the conference did not draw the lines. It merely handed out the pencils. Berlin was not the moment the partition was completed. It was the moment the partition was licensed. What the conference actually produced was a set of protocols, a user's manual for theft. It established the diplomatic mechanisms by which the powers could claim land in the future without triggering a European war. The actual drawing of borders did not happen in a single night. It took place over the next 30 years, from 1885 to 1914, in a series of bilateral treaties and backroom deals known as the Scramble. The process that followed Berlin was a bureaucratic nightmare. The borders of modern Africa were not determined by the geography of the land or the ethnography of its people, but by the haggling of diplomats in London, Paris, Lisbon, and Berlin. These men traded corridors of land like tokens in a board game. A straight line would be drawn on a map in a European capital to settle a dispute between a French outpost and a British trading company, completely ignoring the reality that this line might bisect a kingdom, sever a trade route, or separate a people from their water source. The cynicism of this era was compounded by a profound ignorance. The Europeans were dividing a continent they barely knew. Rumors and anecdotes from the time suggest that some of the most enduring borders in Africa were drawn based on maps that were fundamentally flawed. One famous example of this geographical incompetence involves the Niger River. In the frantic rush to stake claims in West Africa, diplomats relied on early, inaccurate surveys. It is whispered that in some preliminary negotiations, the course of the river was depicted up to 100 kilometers away from its actual location. Treaties were signed, and spheres of influence were agreed upon based on this phantom geography. When the surveyors finally arrived on the ground years later to drive in the boundary posts, they found that the river the treaty referred to was nowhere near the line on the map. Yet to avoid reopening diplomatic wounds, the error often stood. The line remained, an arbitrary scar across the landscape, enforced by colonial troops against confused local populations who suddenly found themselves French or British based on a cartographer's mistake. This highlights the true function of the Berlin Conference. It legitimized a game without rules regarding the African people. In the eyes of international law as defined by the General Act, the indigenous inhabitants were legally invisible. They were not participants in the negotiation. They were merely part of the scenery, akin to the flora and fauna. The conference established a terrifying precedent. The only legitimacy that mattered was recognition by other European powers. An African king could rule a territory for centuries, but if a European power had effectively occupied it and notified the signatories in Berlin, the African king's sovereignty was null and void. The conference stripped the continent of its political agency. Historians argue that this is the crucial distinction between the myth and the reality. Berlin did not slice the pie. It simply agreed on the knife to be used. It was the starting gun for a 30-year race that was frantic, messy, and driven by a fear of missing out. The straight lines that we see on the map of Africa today, those unnatural geometric borders that ignore mountains, rivers, and tribes, were not the work of one evening in 1885. They were the result of decades of corrective scribbling, where the primary goal was not to govern Africa, but to satisfy the balance of power in Europe. Berlin did not divide Africa. It unleashed the chaos that would eventually imprison it. Section 7. The Legacy of Slaughter, from 1885 to Rwanda 1994. By 1914, the project initiated in the smoking room of the Wilhelmstrasse was effectively complete. The scramble was over, and the trap had snapped shut. 90% of the African continent was now under formal European control. The map was filled with colours: British pink, French blue, German grey, and Belgian yellow. But beneath these blocks of colour lay a geopolitical mutilation that would bleed for a century. The diplomats had not just drawn borders. They had dismantled the social DNA of a continent. The most toxic legacy of the Berlin Conference was not the theft of resources, but the careless forcing together of distinct peoples and the brutal separation of kin. The borders drawn by the European powers ignored the complex web of ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries that had existed for millennia. They sliced through kingdoms and forced historical rivals into the same administrative cages. In West Africa, the British created the colony of Nigeria, an artificial construct that forced over 250 distinct ethnic groups, including the Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa Fulani, into a single political entity. In the Congo, Leopold and the Belgians bound together more than 200 ethnic groups. These were not nations born of shared history or identity. They were powder kegs, assembled by foreign bureaucrats who cared only for administrative convenience. The Europeans created states that made no sense to the people living within them, setting the stage for the civil wars and secessionist movements that would engulf the continent after independence. However, The darkest manifestation of this divide and rule strategy, a direct intellectual descendant of the Berlin mindset, exploded in Central Africa, echoing nearly a century later. The tragedy of the Rwandan genocide in 1994 can be traced back to the colonial policies solidified in the wake of the partition. When the Europeans arrived in the Great Lakes region, first the Germans and later the Belgians, they encountered the Hutu and Tutsi populations. Historically, the distinction between these groups was fluid, often based on class, wealth, cattle ownership, and social standing. A Hutu could become a Tutsi and vice versa. But the European colonizers, obsessed with the race science of the late 19th century, could not understand this fluidity. They needed rigid classifications to manage their new subjects effectively. Applying the cynical logic of the colonial era, the Belgian administration ossified these social classes into racial castes. They measured noses, examined skull shapes, and issued identity cards that stamped every citizen as either Hutu or Tutsi. They privileged the minority Tutsis as a ruling class to manage the majority Hutus, deepening resentment and creating a binary hatred where none had existed in such a lethal form before. This policy was the ultimate application of the Berlin spirit, the external imposition of order without regard for human reality. When the machetes were raised in April 1994 and neighbors began to slaughter neighbors, the immediate cause was political, but the deep root was colonial. The million bodies that littered the hills of Rwanda were the horrific final harvest of seeds planted by men who viewed Africans as data points rather than human beings. The psychological devastation was as profound as the physical one. As the independence movement swept the continent in the 1960s, the realization of what had been lost began to set in. It was not just the ivory, the rubber, or the gold. It was the identity of the people. A poignant oral history from a tribal elder in Tanzania, recorded in the 1960s, captured this spiritual theft with heartbreaking clarity. Reflecting on the arrival of the Europeans and the era of treaties and partitions, he said, "The white men came to us with the Bible in one hand and the gun in the other. We closed our eyes to pray, and when we opened them, we had the Bible, but they had our land and our soul." The conference had successfully exported a system of governance that alienated the people from their own history. The states, left behind by the Europeans, were hollow shells, designed for extraction, not for the welfare of citizens. Modern historians now view the event not merely as a diplomatic summit, but as a foundational act of violence that has never been fully adjudicated. As one contemporary historian noted, re-evaluating the long century of conflict, Berlin 1884 is not a meeting, it is a crime scene. It is a crime on which the world has looked with indifference for 140 years. The legacy of the conference is not found in the archives of Berlin, but in the refugee camps, the disputed borders, and the ethnic fissures that continue to destabilize the continent today. The gentlemen in top hats did not just divide land, they engineered a century of chaos, the bill for which is still being paid in blood. Conclusion. The evening that changed a continent forever. The cigars have long since burned out, and the snow that fell on the Wilhelmstrasse in the winter of 1884 melted away more than a century ago. The ghosts of Bismarck, Leopold, and Stanley have faded into history books, their names engraved on statues that are slowly being toppled around the world. But the ink from their pens has proven to be indelible. The Berlin Conference is often remembered through the haze of a myth, a dramatic legend of a single evening where Europe sliced a pie. But the reality was far colder, far more bureaucratic, and infinitely more durable. The conference did not last for a single evening. It was a marathon of calculation that spanned 103 days, from November 15, 1884, to February 26, 1885. It was a season of polite conversation and fine dining, during which the fate of millions was decided between courses. Yet, in the long arc of history, even 103 days is a blink of an eye. The true tragedy of Berlin is not how quickly the decisions were made, but how endlessly the consequences have endured. The decisions made in those 3 months have outlived the empires that made them. The German Empire is gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire has dissolved. The Ottoman Empire is dust. But the borders they drew and the trauma they inflicted remain the defining architecture of modern Africa. The most damning fact of the conference remains the silence. In that grand room, amidst the rustling of maps and the scratching of quills, there was a total void where the African voice should have been. No invitation was sent to the continent being discussed. No translation was offered to the people being divided. And in the 140 years since that winter, that silence has largely continued. To this day, there has been no comprehensive restitution. Of the 14 nations that sat at Bismarck's table to legalize the plunder, the vast majority have never offered a formal apology, let alone reparations, for the systems of extraction they codified. The wealth of Brussels, London, Paris, and Berlin was partly built on the resources secured during the Scramble, yet the check for the damages social, economic, and psychological remains unpaid. The General Act was not a treaty of peace. It was a contract of immunity for the colonizers. In the modern interpretation, Berlin 1884 stands as the ultimate symbol of Western imperialism's dark heart. It represents the moment when cynicism was dressed up in the finest clothes of diplomacy and called a civilizing mission. The delegates congratulated themselves on bringing light to the dark continent, all while drafting the rules for a system that would plunge it into a century of darkness. They spoke of ending the slave trade while inventing a new kind of slavery, one driven by rubber quotas, diamond mines, and tax collection. As we look back at that most cynical treaty, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Berlin Conference is not a closed chapter. It is a living wound. Every time a conflict erupts along an arbitrary border in the Sahel, every time a corporation extracts minerals from the Congo without benefiting the local population, every time the global North dictates policy to the global South, the ghost of Berlin is present. The story of how Europe divided Africa in one evening is a warning from the past. It reminds us that legality is not the same as morality, and that the stroke of a pen in a European capital can cut as deep as a machete in a rainforest. The conference is over. The delegates have gone home. But the question remains for us, the living. Can we truly separate ourselves from this history? Or do we share the responsibility for a world where the architecture of extraction, designed in 1884, continues to function today? The map on the wall has changed, but the lines drawn in the soul of a continent have yet to be erased.